No, no, I don't buy it.
What?
You're not a hitman. You can't be.
Summer of Glen Powell has finally arrived. This year, Glen Powell has both Hitman and Twisters releasing within 6 weeks of each other. Normally, this would launch an actor to the highest of A-list statuses. And Glen Powell certainly seems to be getting more famous after appearing in such hits as Top Gun Maverick and Anyone But You. But is this going to be the summer of Glen Powell, or does movie stardom not exist in the same way that we understood it to exist even somewhere like 10 years ago? That's what I'm going to be exploring in my review of today's film, Hitman, directed by Richard Linklater, which reunites him and Glen Powell. They've worked together a handful of times. I believe Glen Powell's first acting role was in Fast Food Nation, which was directed by Richard Linklater. They've also worked together in such films as Apollo 10.5 and the spiritual sequel to Dazed and Confused, Everybody Wants Some. So they have this deep relationship, which is very clear because Hitman has a screenplay by Richard Linklater and Glen Powell. In Hitman, I really just wanted to focus on a few big questions going into this movie because I think there's two major narratives surrounding Hitman and specifically Glen Powell that I wanted to discuss today in today's review. The first question I have is Glen Powell finally being anointed Hollywood's next big movie star. Look no further than Tom Cruise sending a message to Glen Powell at the premiere of Hitman, and you can see right away Tom Cruise is kind of handpicking Glen Powell to be this guy, and you can see how much Glen Powell and Tom Cruise have alike. And that is the biggest movie star flex you can have literally the guy who has been the movie star king for decades now anoint you as the next big star. Is this going to actually happen? Is this where it all accumulates into Glen Powell taking over? The second question I have is why did most studios seem to pass on Hitman post its 2023 premiere at Venice International Film Festival? And the reason I want to explore this question is because I believe it says a lot about the state of Hollywood and the film industry, especially as it relates to streaming, but we'll be getting to both of those points in a second. For those of you who are not aware what Hitman is or the story surrounding it, Hitman features a cast including Glen Powell, Adria Arjona, Austin Amelio, and Retta from Parks and Recreation fame. And Hitman follows Gary, an undercover New Orleans police contractor who poses as a hitman and meets Maddie, a desperate woman who enlists his services to kill her abusive husband, only for Gary to find himself falling for Maddie and personifying his false personas in this sexy, dark comedy set in New Orleans. That is the premise of Hitman. And that's what we're going to explore today, because I think this premise is extremely easily accessible. And that was one thing that I noticed with this movie, because Richard Linklater is an indie filmmaker. He is not someone who widely appears in the mainstream. Not to say that he hasn't had mainstream hits such as School of Rock or even other films like Boyhood, like Dazed and Confused, that pick up and exist within the cultural zeitgeist. But he is someone who likes to be left alone in Texas and kind of do his thing on his terms, which makes him not always the most commercial director. With that said, going into this film, and I'm going to start off with the second question that I have, why did most studios seem to pass on Hitman post its 2023 premiere at Venice International Film Festival? I remember reading something where someone described the dark comedy aspect of this movie akin to something like Banshees of Inisherin, a film that I really enjoyed, but I know that is an incredibly dark, hard film for audiences to get involved in. So going into Hitman, I was like, what is the tonality of this film going to be? And is it going to be a bit too dark? Is it just not going to click with modern audiences? And that's why they didn't pick up this film. And I think that point of Banshees of Inisherin is not the correct framework to discuss Hitman in. Hitman certainly has some dark humor in it, especially as it relates to the profession of hitman, but it is a very broadly accessible comedy. It features Glen Powell in a lot of costumes, doing a lot of funny accents. It has a very broad sexiness to it, And it is really just this film of mistaken identities that works really well in this film. It zigs where it should zag, and it zags where it should zig. And that's where this film is fascinating, because I think that's what makes it so fresh and alive. It's just a film that kind of keeps you guessing, even though you kind of know where this film has to lead to. And this film is so successful because of what Glen Powell brings to this role. It is a movie star performance if you've ever seen one. What he is able to do with comedy, what he is able to do as a sex appeal, as what he is able to do as just a writer, writing himself really great lines of comedy and delivering them with perfection. What he is able to do as a tough guy and bringing an intensity to this role. He really is just everything that you'd want out of a movie star. He has wonderful chemistry with Adria in this film, and it makes for this really enjoyable ride where you are just really invested in this character of Gary, who starts off this guy with no confidence and goes on. And it's a film about how we all have a little bit of a darkness in us, and when we're given a little room to let that darkness breathe, what that can lead to and the excitement of that. And that's what I would really describe Hitman as. It is a very exciting film about relationships, the lies we tell each other, and how much we're willing to let our ego and our self-belief get in our own way / not get in our own way. This film is about breaking your expectations and breaking oneself's expectations on what they can do as a person. It is a philosophical movie, as seen by the fact that Glen Powell's character is a psychology professor discussing topics such as the id, the ego, the superego, all that. You see the philosophical and the psychological all coming together in this film, and you understand what brings Richard Linklater into this as a film about relationships, which is something that Linklater has always explored in his movies. Specifically, look at the Before franchise / series. Those 3 films really show a relationship aging and going through it. And that's what this film is. It's not a heart-throbbing emotion that you see necessarily in the Before trilogy, but it is an emotion that does feel tonally accurate to experiences lived. And that's what I enjoy in Richard Linklater's screenplay. And it's something that I found very interesting that Glen Powell can connect to as a writer of Hitman. The fact that he was able to kind of go toe for toe with Richard Linklater and create something that you could see felt so personal and lived in for both of these characters. And everyone is great in this film. Adria has wonderful chemistry with Glen. This character of Maddie is just a really complex, really just, you feel the emotion right away of this character. You feel an empathy for her. You feel an excitement. You understand why anyone would want to cross paths with this character of Maddie and why these two develop the bond instantaneously. And that's so important because the romance is front and center of Hitman. And everything about this film I really enjoyed. Austin Amelio plays Jasper, a corrupt cop in this movie. He's wonderful in this movie. I don't even really want to go into why he's wonderful in this film. They set up this joke with the character of Jasper that just explains everything you need to know about this guy. Despite only knowing him for a minute, you understand exactly who this figure is, who he represents, and why this character of Gary essentially has to step in for this character of Jasper and pretend to be a hitman. And that's a really key point of this movie, is you see everyone in their flaws, and you also understand what essentially lying to yourself does over a multitude of years, and the type of people who have to go into this work to essentially be fake 24/7. And that is where Hitman is at its most rewarding, when it is this exploration of these characters. I think some people will watch Hitman and think that it is a bit too on the nose. There are story beats that you do recognize, and you can largely guess where the first act, second act, third act goes. I think it's the interpersonal relationships within those acts and how those relationships go and how they twist and churn, which makes this film not feel conventional. And that's where I found it exciting. It is able to use the framework of convention and weaponize it within the minutia detail to create something that I found riveting and exciting. And I've already talked about it. You can probably tell right away that this is a really positive review of Hitman. And Glen Powell, having done all this work the past few years, having been a established actor now for a handful of years, paying his dues, getting to be in roles like this, really getting discovered by Linklater, getting to appear in smaller roles, getting the big opportunity with Top Gun Maverick, and just kept going with that. And with this and Twisters coming out in basically a month of each other, you really feel the excitement and palpability of Glen Powell taking over, which is why I wanted to ask the second question, is Glen Powell finally being anointed Hollywood's next big movie star? And I think it's pretty obvious. That speech of Tom Cruise basically saying, Glen Powell, your time has come. There is no better explanation to how Hollywood feels about this guy. Tom Cruise doesn't give that speech to everybody or anyone really. You really feel the passion that people have for this guy and the work he has done. And there's certainly an audience appeal of it. Like I said, I know Hollywood is filled with tall, sexy men, and that is kind of the bread and butter, white, good-looking men who can just be People's Magazine's sexiest man alive and also have a good humor to them and be a good actor. Hollywood, like I said, has hundreds upon hundreds of them. Glen Powell has a talent that is very clearly in his comedic sensibilities and his writing and his willingness to just engage with himself and play all the tropes. And it's just this other personal side for him where you can really feel the fun that he is having with performances. No one makes acting look as effortless as Glen Powell is making it look right now. This is all the makings of a big movie star. But the reason I still ask this first question is because just because someone is supposed to be that movie star and 10, 20 years ago would have become this movie star, can this type of movie star exist in the confounds of 2024? And I think we need to actually explore that to understand a bit more of Hitman. Because I posed this question earlier, why did most major studios pass on this film? I don't know. That's the weird thing about this. I don't think this film was particularly expensive to make. It got bought out by Netflix by $20 million for its distribution rights. This film is a romantic comedy that has a little bit of an edge to it. And it has a certain level of sex to it. But it's not abrasive. It's not like this overtly charged film, but it's certainly steamy. It's certainly passionate. It feels like a movie that it lives within the same context of Anyone But You, where Glen Powell is just with a beautiful woman and you feel that chemistry right on screen. And it's just like, wow, that's two really beautiful people who seem really into each other. That seems like it should be enough to sell a movie. But yet I'm not sure if that is. And maybe that's what the studios were scared of. Are studios scared of sex? I don't know the answer to that. Are studios scared of comedies? It kind of seems like that. Most comedies now seem to exist wholly within the streaming service world. A lot of these films that are now traditionally comedy are packaged as something else as well. Even look at something like Poor Things, which I think is a really funny movie, but Poor Things isn't the most traditional of comedies. And so with Hitman, what's happening then? Because this film actually has a broadness to it. This one has a commercial appeal. This one has good-looking people. This film has an international actress who seems to be able to have some form of an audience. And this has a guy who is about to become what seems to be like a big movie star. So why were studios hesitant of it? And I think it is this issue with comedy. I think this is this issue with sex. And I think largely the reason it is because Hollywood seems so risk averse right now, and specifically streaming services seem so in need of content that they're going to keep buying it out at the cost of undercutting the theatrical experience. Because I saw this movie in a theater. This movie plays really well in the theater. This was a movie that the audience that I saw with was really into it. And I think that would have been the mainstream reaction for this movie had people gone to see it. And what I'm worried about is I think there isn't logic, and I understand the logic of this, that Hitman is probably going to become more seen because it's on Netflix, which may be true. But I don't know if that makes it more important or gives it quite the attention that it would if it is in theaters. And that's where I'm worried about. So this idea of, is Glen Powell going to become a star? I think he should. I think he has everything that you could want in a next major movie star. But with that said, that doesn't guarantee it. And Netflix certainly doesn't guarantee movie stardom. This should be his huge, huge break. And then this on top of Twisters a month later, that should put him on that level where it's just like, well, we got our next leading man for the next 10 years. And maybe it still does. Maybe there is enough juice in him as a film star to get him over that level. But I think putting it on streaming does this film a disservice where it just doesn't feel as important. It almost feels passed aside. And I think that's the idea of what happened at Venice International Film Festival. This film kind of just seemed to get passed aside because I think this would have been a great acquisition for most major studios. And I think this would have been a film that probably made a profit. That's always hard to say. And I know I'm not a box office analyst on that, but I don't think this film would have been particularly expensive to make, to distribute. And what is the box office gross on this film? How much does it need to gross to become a at least certified hit and then, get its next legs on streaming? I don't know, but I think that might have been the better strategy for this movie. But streaming and movies just don't seem to work these days. Like, I don't think streaming is the place movies should be in, because being on streaming makes it feel not skippable. Skippable is the wrong word, but it makes it feel a little bit disposable. And I think Hollywood the past 5 years has been continuing to put films about comedy, about sex on streaming service, which makes the genre itself feel a bit disposable right now. Is Glen Powell finally being anointed? I think the answer is yes. And I think he is going to become somewhat of a big deal the next few years. And I think he's certainly bought himself the time to prove himself and give himself more opportunities. Does that mean he's going to be the next Amelio? I don't think so. But does this mean he at least has a future for the next few years? And if he capitalizes on the success, he could really build a meaningful career. I think that's more where he lies. Second question about why did this film not get picked up right away and why did it have to go to Netflix? I just don't think studios are interested in making these types of films anymore. And the genre itself of comedy exists on streaming. And that devaluing of it the past few years has basically destroyed what was one of the most fundamental institutions of movie theaters, comedy. Bring people together, get them laughing, get that spreading. Laughter's, spreads quick. And you've taken that away. You've taken that away from this movie's chance of success. That's where I think we are right now. Really enjoyed Hitman, and I really do recommend you all seek this film out. Enjoy yourself because this is a damn good film, and I hope to get more of this from Glen Powell. Thank you all for watching. Oh, quick, I'm giving this film 4 out of 5 stars.